And and she said, 10 years I said Psalms to healing, and it seemed to have worked. She's had 6 kids since then. That's the doctor who said she wouldn't be able to have kids. There were many miracles in Sfat. 6 years working as a social worker there. One that comes to mind is an unusual one. Working with Ethiopian Jewish orphans who had come to Sfat. Each of them had stories of their parents who had been killed on their way to Israel. Yet the story we heard more than once, related in a calm, relaxed manner from each of these young Ethiopian Jewish young men, was that they slept through the Sudan, and made it to Israel. And this was the price of returning to Israel, even though they lost the people who they loved the most, their parents. With the focus of energy changing in 1987, in the work that I do, the effort to launch a news agency to present news stories that would balance the news stories that were promoted by the other side produced many, many surprises. Just a few. December 1987, meeting a doctor by the name of Dr. Eli Lash, who had been the director of medical services in Gaza for the Israel Civil Administration. His first words to me were very strange. You know, David, I must work for the Mossad because everything I do is a secret. I said, what do you mean? He held up a letter from the World Health Organization congratulating him for ending infant mortality in Gaza and trying to organize press briefings for Dr. Lash to show that what Israel had accomplished in Gaza at a time when so much press was coming out about Israeli oppression in Gaza. As a matter of fact, 3 or 4 months later, some Palestinian medical group put out a memo saying that Dr. Lash had caused infant mortality in Gaza, not solved it. January 1988, looking for a positive story from the Palestinian perspective, our agency met with Dr. Mubarak Awad, the head of the Center for Nonviolence, Palestinian Center for Nonviolence, except that his message was that he would be in an alliance with those who were committing violence. He would commit nonviolence and they would commit violence. And we asked him, how does this jive with the view of Dr. Martin Luther King and Gandhi had his pictures there. He said, well, I'm much more pragmatic than they are. April 1988. One morning, coming late to work, coming late to Bedein, there was a press conference happening, and I hadn't heard the news that morning Abu Jihad, Arafat's military guy, had been killed on a beach in Tunis. 2 Arab reporters came up to me at Bedein and said, you know, the Mossad killed Abu Jihad. I said, how do you know? I said, well, they didn't kill his wife and children. I said, can I put that in my repertoire? They asked me, what's a repertoire? Forget about it. But that's very interesting. January 1989, Dr. Mustafa Barghouti comes to Bedein, organizes a press conference. He was the head of the Union of Palestine Medical Relief Committees, and he had a theory that Israel had tear gas which killed Palestinian children. Now, it seemed laughable. I tried taking it seriously because I saw how many people were at the press conference. He produced diagrams and all this kind of stuff. And the Israel Foreign Ministry decided not to respond. This then became a mantra for the next 6 months until our agency hired a medical professional to show that it couldn't be possible to have tear gas which kills people, especially kills children. But this was what can happen in an era that many things are believed. July 1989, we discovered that Amnesty International and other human rights groups were employing members of terrorist organizations on their staffs. And we brought over one of the officials of Amnesty International, a man named Richard Riop, to make a presentation where he said so, admitted so. He said he saw nothing wrong with them because they weren't members of governments. Well, our agency made a to-do out of it, and working at that time with articles we put out together with the ADL, questioning the ethics of putting people who are members of terrorist organizations on your staff. On November 1st, 1989, Amnesty wrote a letter to the Jerusalem Post refuting yours truly, saying that, quote, just because a person is a member of a violent organization does not mean that he is violent. There was a great comedian in the United States named Red Skelton who would say, I just do them, I don't explain them. Then there was the January 1991 stint with CNN Radio, standing there on Rehov Abba Hillel Silver, in Ramat Gan. Those of you who were here then will remember what happened there, the total destruction. The news story to communicate to the United States was that 450 homes had been destroyed by one missile from Iraq. Yet the editor at CNN Radio Atlanta wouldn't run it as a lead story. As a matter of fact, he put it off for a while because no one had been killed. There were no casualties to report. As they say in the news biz, only when it bleeds, it leads. The fact that 10,500 homes had been hit by missiles with exactly one person killed by a direct hit escaped press attention. It's not even in our minds. It would seem that miracles do not go over well with the media. In March 1991, covering for CNN Radio in Germany, with an account of how German-owned American firms had supplied WMD capacity to Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. The American consul said to our agency, we were 3 people who came, that the American government would rather not have this publicized. It was surprising to me, but that's what he said. Well, it was a news story that made people in Germany and the US very nervous. The story in April was presented in Bonn by Ramat Gan victims of missile attacks and by Kurdish victims of missile attacks to a packed press conference in Bonn. Yet the news story went nowhere. And most people to this day are not aware of the continuing involvement of 88 German firms, most of which are registered outside of Germany, in the supply of WMD capacity, weapons of mass destruction capacity, to Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Libya. Moving to behind-the-scenes stories of the Oslo process, our agency carefully followed one reporter in Tunis in September 1993, Pinchas Inbari, of the left-wing Israeli paper known as Al-Mishmar, associated with Maqam, who reported that what the PLO reported to its own people in September 1993 was that the Oslo process was the first stage of gaining everything back in Palestine lost in 1948. Yet the most amazing and newsworthy story that emerged from Inbari's column in Tunis, we were translated into English, that was our job to do it, was that Arafat could not or did not want to get a quorum to ratify the Oslo Accord. And so it was that the headline of the October 6, 1993 Al-Mishmar newspaper was that the PLO never recognized the Oslo Accord. Yet the same day, the Israel Foreign Ministry, then run by Shimon Peres and Yossi Beilin, praised the PLO for ratifying the Oslo Accord. Upon his return to Israel, Inbari was supposed to give an interview for the Voice of Israel radio, but a call from a senior Israeli government official caused the radio to yank Inbari from ever being interviewed. And the Israeli public never found out that the PLO never ratified the Oslo Accords. And so it was with the conference set up by the PLO to cancel the dreaded PLO covenant, which called for Israel's destruction. We sent in the only TV crew, Israel Resource News Agency sent in the only TV crew that filmed the event on April 24th, 1996, when the PLO would not cancel their covenant. It's on tape. Professor Yoshua Porat from Hebrew University evaluated all the protocols. A man who had been on the merits ticket in the Knesset, founder of Peace Now, found that there was no cancellation. Yet, U.S. Ambassador Indyk, Israel Foreign Minister Peres, both attested to the cancellation of the PLO covenant. This was significant because on that basis, Arafat was allowed to come to the first of many state visits to the White House on totally false pretenses. Now, there was the confusion in the reportage of events in the Oslo process was indeed the norm. In April 1995, the Voice of Israel radio reported that Arafat had ordered the confiscation of weapons in the hands of terrorists. Except the word used in the memo sent out by Arafat was that he would register the weapons in the hands of terrorists, not confiscate them. A little bit of a difference. And that was a news story that our agency worked on for a month, eventually sold it to the New York Times. It was front page of the New York Times a few weeks later. It made it on page 15 of the Yad Afronot between the sex ads and the investment ads. If you weren't looking for one of those two, you would have missed the story. The impression given by Arafat, however, in his personal opinion, in his personal meetings with people, was very, very interesting. Organizing a group of people to meet with Arafat and ask him questions in November of 1996 was an amazing experience. We brought with us a very leading intelligence analyst who was able to assess Arafat's body language during the interview with the agency, that he didn't seem capable of violence. Now, the fact that we had conducted interviews with Arafat's aides in a movie we'd previously done for PBS, that one of his aides said Arafat had only killed 12 people with his own hands was kind of reassuring. But the impression that Arafat was building an entity of peace was helped along by his friends and advocates in Israel. On March 1st, 2000, Shimon Peres, who was then the Minister of Development, of Regional Development, proclaimed at a media colloquy with him that Arafat had launched a curriculum of peace in the PA. But when it was pointed out to Peres that this curriculum had been vetoed by Arafat, Peres walked away from the microphone and said, "I know." A few months later, during the summer of 2000, when the new Palestinian Authority books were published, Israel Resource traveled each day to Ramallah to purchase the new Palestinian school books, which were more like war manuals, preparing children for war against Israel. What we discerned, however, was that there was no interest in the Israeli government. As a matter of fact, sitting at a press conference with Shlomo Ben-Ami, who was then the Israel foreign minister, I received a cell phone call from the Vatican's ambassador in Israel. And he said he wanted that the Pope and the people around the Pope wanted to see the books. I remarked this is the first time I've ever getting a cell call from the Vatican, but okay. So we went up to and it was actually funny. There are funny moments in our work that the ambassador had called my house, and all my children thought it was someone certain people making voices, and it wasn't really the Vatican ambassador. And then they called my house, my office, my secretary said, "This can't be the Vatican ambassador," but it was the Vatican ambassador. And as it turned out, Ambassador Sami, His Excellency, commissioned the translations of the Palestinian school books and advised the Italian government to cancel its participation in the Palestinian school books because of its virulent anti-Semitism. Until this day, there has been no Israeli request to cancel the Palestinian school curriculum. Instead, experts who follow the incitement of the Palestinian Authority in Israeli intelligence and the Israeli Foreign Ministry have been quietly removed from their positions. This year, there's been a change. Our agency just interviewed the people around Moshe Ya'alon, senior government minister, who has reinstated a number of people to look at the school books, to look at the incitement, etc. But the passion of the Israel Foreign Ministry is not in that direction. Instead, in the direction of economic ties to Israeli businesses, while Palestinian refugee camps are left to fester. Meanwhile, the right of return campaign is in full force. Everyone talks about Israel's economic relations with the Palestinian Authority, how great it is, and it is something to see. 25 billion shekels of exports on the books. Who knows what's off the books? What's on the books going to the PA? That's a tremendous amount of money, including about 4.5 billion going to Gaza. That's what people are paying attention to. One of my colleagues, a journalist from Winnipeg, did an interview with 60 Palestinian business people to ask them a simple question, the people who are doing business with Israel. He asked a simple question. Even though now that you're doing business in Israel, are you going to abandon the armed struggle? And are you going to abandon the right of return? You know, the right to take back your homes from 48. The answer in both cases was no. So I'll conclude this portion of the discussion with a seminal moment that we had in accompanying a journalist about 15 years ago to it was the first year of the Oslo process, and one of the things we did was accompany journalists. So we took a reporter to a factory that repackages food from the kibbutz movement. It was up on a big hill not far from Hebron. And we're schlepping up there. He's a tall fellow, and I'm not the tallest person in the world. We're walking up there like a button Jeff kind of routine. And as we're coming up there, the head of the factory is calling out to us, "You know, you come to see what we do here. You know, we hate the Jews, we're going to burn the Jews, we're going to kill the Jews." You know, so this is not going to be the best of stories. He was going to do the economic story. We get up there, he receives us with a coffee after saying those things. And then then the reporter says, "Well, we're here to hear about your work with what you're doing in business with Israel and the kibbutz movement." "Oh, you don't understand how much I love the kibbutz movement, and I'm in the Jewish homes all the time. I'm in the homes all the time." So the journalist with me, he said,